Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. With today's session, we begin a new unit in which we're going to study a time period that is generally loosely referred to as the Age of Absolutism. Now, absolutism was a governmental power structure that was prominent in some of the most powerful countries in Europe from the mid-1500s through, the 1700s or so. Now, during this unit, we're going to examine some of the most important leaders in these countries during this time and how their actions helped to shape not only their time, but also the centuries to come. I guess before we could do any of that stuff, we kind of need to nail down exactly what absolutism is, and that's kind of the subject of today's session. The Age of Absolutism, what is absolutism? So let's take a look at those essential questions. So as I just said, we're going to figure out what absolutism is here in today's session. Not only, what is it, but, why was this a semi-popular form of government during the 1500s and 1600s? How do you justify this kind of government, this kind of power? Then we're going to take it a step further, and we're going to compare absolutism to other common forms of government, stuff that you would find in Europe during this time, and also a more modern kind of government that you hopefully know pretty well given the country that you live in. So those are the essential questions. That's what we're going to hit today. Thus, without further ado, let's go ahead and begin. Now, during the 1500s and 1600s, a lot of monarchs in Europe began to work towards ending the independence of cities and feudal territories. Because even though, we've got much, much stronger centralized monarchical governments, you do have, sort of regional areas that are still largely controlled by some powerful nobles. You've got cities that have had measures of independence for a while, and we've got monarchs wanting to rein all of that in to gain complete control over their governments. And their authority is based on a concept that is referred to as absolutism. Absolutism is a form of government structure in which unlimited power is held either by one individual, like, the king, or perhaps a group of people, like the king and his advisors, or, the king and his top government bureaucrats. Absolutism could just be a single all-powerful government rather than just an all-powerful person, but absolutism, at its core, is a situation in which the government is all-powerful and there are no limits on its power. Now, how do you justify something like this? Especially, when we think of it in our time, the idea of a government with unlimited power seems, at least in our country anyway, completely ludicrous. But, during this time, rulers justified the concept of absolutism through something that was known as divine right. Divine right's very similar to the Eastern concept of mandate of heaven, as they called it. But divine right suggests that a ruler and his bloodline has been divinely chosen by the heavens, by God, and thus given complete authority to rule directly from God. That God has anointed this ruler, this family, this bloodline, and given them their authority to rule. And as such, this ruler answers to no earthly power. This ruler does not answer to the citizens. This ruler does not answer to law or to the courts. They are responsible to and answer only to God for their actions. That's quite a lofty standing in the world, if you ask me, if you think the only person you answer to is God. But that's what the concept of divine right was. And in the belief of people who were, these types of monarchs that believed in divine right, for them, going against the king in any way was like committing an egregious sin, because the king was anointed by God, was, while not, a living God in the Egyptian sense, was practically divine in some ways, and so to go against the king, to rebel against the king, was an egregious sin against God. Now, in a more practical kind of way, it was reasoned that if you centralized power in one person or one group of people, you could create a much more stable government system rather than having, squabbling nobles all sort of fighting for control. If you just centralize power in one person or one group of people with one common ideology, you create stability and you create unity. You could unify a country behind that leader and that ideology. At least that was the reasoning behind it. Additionally, putting all the power in the hands of one person or one small group of people was thought to make government more efficient, create more solid, stable control in government. So, as it seems, the main argument in favor of absolute government is national unity, is government efficiency, and more stability and control. And on paper, that sure sounds kind of nice. Very pie in the sky, let's hold hands and sing Kumbaya around an environmentally friendly campfire kind of thing. But, in reality, absolutism is typically characterized by a powerful, oppressive government. And history has shown us that the more powerful a government is, the more oppressive it becomes. And the more powerful and oppressive the government is, the fewer and fewer freedoms and liberties the citizens have. And that becomes the trade-off in this kind of system. Do you accept that you live under a government with absolute authority and perhaps you have more stability and unity, and in exchange you lose out on those freedoms and rights? That's potentially the trade-off here when you're looking at that kind of government. Does it have its advantages? Maybe. Does it have its disadvantages? It sure does. And speaking of that, let's compare absolutism to some other government forms, more ones that are during its time period and then something a little bit more contemporary. So when you look at absolutism, you're looking at a government that is all-powerful, unlimited in its control. And power could be held by one single all-powerful ruler, or it could be a group of people, it could be just a king, a monarch, or it could be the monarch and his council, his advisors, or it could be just absolute power and control for the government. But the bottom line, like we mentioned earlier, under absolutism is that you have unlimited power for the government, whether it's a single person or a group of people or the entire bureaucracy. Now, in an absolutist system, or really any monarchy, leadership is hereditary. How do you gain power? You're born into it. You inherit that power through birth, through familial relations. How did you become king? Because your dad was king or your uncle was king. And who becomes king after you? Some relative of yours. Okay, leadership is hereditary. You're born into it. And as mentioned before, are there some advantages? Perhaps. It certainly would appear to be more efficient, maybe bring about greater national unity and stability. And then, of course, the disadvantages we brought up were pretty clear. The more powerful the government, the less freedom and liberty the people have. Now, something that was contemporary to a lot of these absolutist governments was limited or constitutional monarchy, particularly. Where are you going to find this? In England. And England is one of the countries that we'll look at, as a matter of fact. It'll be the only one that's not an absolute government, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. So in a limited or constitutional monarchy, government power is shared between a monarch and a legislature. The monarch acts more as an executive would, like an executive branch that we can think of, but power is shared between the legislature and the monarch. The government is bound by law, and it's limited by some kind of a constitution. In England, you think like the Magna Carta and other documents that we'll see in the future. Limit the government, bound it by law, unlike an absolute government where there are no limits to its power. And specifically in a limited or constitutional monarchy, the limits are clearly placed on the power of the monarch to prevent him from being too powerful. Now, members of the legislature in a limited or constitutional monarchy are chosen through elections. This is an element of that Magna Carta concept of representative government, right? Representative government, limited government. So members of the legislature, they're chosen through elections. The position of monarch is still hereditary. You still become king because your dad was king, and then your son will be king. So that is still hereditary. Are there advantages here? Certainly there are. One of the main advantages, limited government, a government that has limited power. The people's voice being a bit more represented. And in that regard, greater protections of freedoms and liberties. Now, in a limited monarchy, it's going to be far from perfect, but it's better than you're going to have in an absolute government system. The disadvantages, when you have an elected legislature, you're going to have a diversity of opinions. A diversity of opinions leads to political factions, which leads to political parties who disagree, which means infighting between these political factions and parties, which slows down the wheels of government and makes government less efficient. But again, it's a trade-off. Limited government, representative government, things slow down and you get political parties and factionalism. What are you willing to accept? How about a constitutional republic? Hey, that's us. Something a bit more modern here. Well, in our style of government, a constitutional republic, government responsibility is shared between multiple branches of government. No monarchy exists. We know that. This is the United States. Our branches, of course, are a legislative and executive and a judicial branch. The powers of government are broken into three separate branches, specifically to prevent one group or individual or branch from becoming too powerful. In an absolutist system, the power to make law, the power to enforce law, and the power to judge law all rests in one place. But in a constitutional republic like ours, those powers are split up to prevent any one group or individual from gaining too much power. Our system is really set up to keep the government limited. The government is bound by laws and limited by our Constitution, by our Bill of Rights. That's the name of the game. Limit the government, prevent it from becoming too powerful. In our system, members of the legislature and our chief executive are all chosen through elections. Of course, we all know this. This is an element of representative government. One of those basic, going all the way back, Magna Carta principles, going back to the Greeks, going back to the Romans. Advantages, again, limited government, the people's voice being represented, even greater protections of freedoms and liberties than you might even have in a limited monarchy. The disadvantages are going to be pretty much the same. Again, when you elect legislatures, you get that diversity of opinion, which leads to factions, political parties, infighting, slows down the wheels of government. And in our case, then we also do a great job of creating government bureaucracies, which really slow things down too. But that'll be another story for your government class in the future. All right, so I think we managed to answer the question we set out towards today. What is absolutism? We established that it is a government power structure in which an individual or a group or the government has complete unlimited power. And we kind of saw how it became popular, how they justified it through divine right. And there was the thought that it would bring efficiency and unity and stability. But of course, we know that there are trade-offs because in exchange for that unity and, quote, stability and efficiency, individuals lose out on freedoms and rights. We then went ahead and compared absolutism to some other government systems, limited monarchy, constitutional republic, to see how they all stacked up against one another. So those are the essential questions. That's what we covered today. Make sure you study those. Make sure you know those. Be ready to talk about those the next time that we meet. And as always, until that time, I bid you farewell.